Ancient Greek parties sound exciting on paper, mostly because the word party does a lot of heavy lifting. In reality, what people often imagine as a joyful night of music, laughter, and carefree indulgence was usually something much slower, more rigid, and far more uncomfortable than modern expectations would allow. These gatherings were called symposia, which literally means drinking together, though the emphasis was often more on togetherness than enjoyment. If you were invited, it was not necessarily because you were fun, it was because you were useful, respectable, or at least acceptable company. The setting was usually a private home, not a grand hall. Guests reclined on low couches arranged carefully around the room. Reclining sounds luxurious until you remember that cushions were thin, floors were hard, and you were expected to stay in roughly the same position for hours. Sitting upright was considered uncultured. Slouching incorrectly was also frowned upon. The art of lying down politely took practice, and newcomers often got it wrong in silence. Wine was central to the evening, but not in the way people imagine. Drinking wine straight was considered barbaric. Instead, it was diluted with water, sometimes heavily, sometimes less so, depending on how wild the host felt like pretending to be. The mixing bowl sat in the center of the room, like a reminder that moderation was mandatory, at least at first. Someone, usually appointed by the host, decided the ratio. This person effectively controlled the mood of the entire evening, which is a strange amount of power to give someone holding a ladle. Conversation was expected, but not casual. Topics leaned toward philosophy, politics, poetry, and moral questions that had no intention of being resolved. Talking too much was rude. Talking too little was suspicious. Saying something foolish could follow you socially for years. This was not a place to relax. It was a place to perform calm intelligence while reclining at an awkward angle and hoping your cup would be refilled at a respectable pace. Entertainment arrived in the form of music, poetry, recitations, or hired performers. These were not spontaneous jam sessions. They were scheduled, deliberate, and often symbolic. Someone might sing while accompanying themselves on a stringed instrument, and everyone else was expected to listen quietly, appreciating the skill without clapping, cheering, or doing anything that suggested enthusiasm. Enjoyment was internal. Visible delight was considered a lack of discipline. As the night went on, the wine-to-water ratio often changed. Conversations loosened. Jokes became slightly less philosophical and slightly more pointed. Insults might be exchanged, but cleverly and ideally in verse. Games were played, including ones involving flinging leftover wine at a target, which sounds fun until you realize you are indoors, lying down, and wearing the only decent clothing you own. It is also important to note who was not there. Respectable women did not attend these parties. Enslaved people were present, but only to serve. Their presence was constant and invisible at the same time. They poured drinks, cleared cups, and listened to everything, without being allowed to exist socially. Any illusion of equality at these gatherings stopped immediately at the edge of the couch. As the night grew later, things could become louder and less refined, but even chaos had rules. Losing control completely was embarrassing. Forgetting yourself too much could damage your reputation. The goal was not to escape your daily life, but to demonstrate that even while drinking, you remained composed, educated, and superior to someone else in the room. Eventually, the party ended not with a dramatic farewell, but with people slowly leaving, trying to stand after hours of reclining, and realizing their legs did not fully agree with the decision. The next day, life continued as usual. There were no fond memories of dancing until sunrise. Mostly, there was a mild headache, lingering social judgment, and the quiet relief that you had said nothing truly unforgivable. So yes, ancient Greek parties existed. They involved wine, conversation, and company. But they were less about joy and more about control. Less celebration, more endurance. And if you were hoping for something lively, you probably went home early, quietly disappointed and slightly damp from someone else's poorly aimed cup. By the time the symposium reached its later hours, the room usually smelled like warm wine, oil lamps, and human patients wearing thin. The lamps burned low, casting uneven shadows that made everyone look a little more dramatic and a little more tired than they actually felt. At this point, the illusion of effortless wisdom began to crack. Voices grew louder. Arguments circled back on themselves, and the same philosophical point might be restated 3 times by 3 different men, each convinced he had phrased it best. Despite the drinking, there were still expectations. Falling asleep was rude, vomiting was humiliating, Laughing too freely suggested you were not in control of yourself, which was perhaps the greatest social sin of all. Even drunkenness had a narrow, acceptable range. You were allowed to appear relaxed, but never sloppy. Anyone who crossed that line became a lesson rather than a guest. Food, if it appeared at all, was secondary. Ancient Greek parties were not about eating well. Snacks were simple and sparse, meant to keep people functional rather than satisfied. Hunger was tolerated. Excess was suspect. The real nourishment was supposed to come from conversation and shared culture, though many guests probably would have preferred bread. As the night wore on, the social hierarchy became clearer rather than blurred. Older men spoke more. Younger men listened, unless invited to contribute, which often felt like a test disguised as generosity. Guests of lower status nodded politely, laughed at the right moments, and avoided drawing attention. The party was a performance, and everyone knew their role. At some point, the symposium might spill out into the streets in the form of a komos, a drunken procession involving singing, shouting, and questionable dignity. This is often imagined as the wild part, but even here there were limits. Public disorder could attract trouble. The city was not impressed by your poetry at midnight. Neighbors were not charmed by philosophical yelling. Many guests quietly opted out before things reached this stage, choosing sleep over spectacle. For the enslaved people who had been present all evening, the end of the party did not bring relief so much as transition. Cups still needed cleaning. Furniture needed rearranging. Lamps needed extinguishing carefully. Their work continued after the last guest left, long after the final argument faded into the night. The next morning, the symposium lingered socially, even if it ended physically. What you said would be remembered. How you behaved would be quietly discussed. A clever remark might elevate your reputation. An awkward silence might haunt you. The hangover, if there was one, was not the most dangerous consequence. When people today imagine ancient Greek parties, they often project modern ideas of freedom and fun onto a culture that valued restraint above all else. These gatherings were not escapes from daily life, but extensions of it. They reinforced who mattered, who listened, and who poured the wine. In the end, ancient Greek parties were not terrible. They were simply not joyful in the way people expect. They were structured, judgmental, and quietly exhausting. If you attended one, you did not go to lose yourself. You went to be seen remaining exactly who you were supposed to be, even as the wine slowly ran out and everyone pretended they were still enjoying themselves. And after all of that quiet effort, the strange thing is how little evidence remains that these parties were meant to be remembered fondly. There were no souvenirs, no shared photographs, no stories retold for joy alone. What survived were fragments in texts, secondhand descriptions, and the careful tone of men who wanted to be remembered as thoughtful rather than drunk. Even when ancient writers recalled these gatherings, they did so as teaching moments, not celebrations. The party itself was never the point. The lesson extracted afterward was, time moved slowly inside these rooms. Without clocks, the night stretched according to the length of the wine supply and the host's patience. Lamps burned down unevenly, and someone eventually had to decide whether to add more oil or accept that the evening was ending. This decision was rarely announced. It simply happened, like a shared understanding that no one wanted to be the last person still trying to sound profound. There was also the constant pressure of being observed. Even in a private home, reputation was always present. Every guest was both audience and performer. Silence could be interpreted as thoughtfulness or as ignorance. Speaking too confidently invited challenge. Being challenged and failing to respond elegantly could undo years of careful self-presentation. For something called a party, it required remarkable emotional restraint. It is worth remembering that most people in ancient Greece never attended a symposium at all. These gatherings belonged to a narrow slice of society, free men with leisure, status, and the right social connections. For everyone else, evenings were quiet, tiring, and short. After work ended, there was little energy left for philosophy. The idea that ancient Greek life was filled with wine-soaked debates applies to very few people, most of whom already had more than enough attention. Even among those invited, enthusiasm varied. Some likely attended out of obligation rather than desire. Declining an invitation could be interpreted as arrogance or insult. Showing up, reclining properly, and contributing just enough was often safer than staying home. Attendance was a form of maintenance, not indulgence. And then there was the inevitable discomfort of the physical space itself. Rooms filled with reclining bodies were warm and poorly ventilated. Oil lamps consumed oxygen quietly. Smoke clung to hair and fabric. After hours of lying on one side, arms went numb, backs stiffened, and the romantic image of ancient leisure gave way to a strong desire to stand up without attracting attention. Leaving required its own small performance. You could not simply get up and go. There were farewells to navigate, compliments to exchange, and subtle signals to read. Leaving too early suggested boredom, leaving too late suggested desperation. The ideal exit was barely noticed, which was difficult in a room designed to notice everything. If the party ended peacefully, it was considered a success. No arguments escalated beyond clever insults. No one embarrassed themselves beyond repair. No furniture was broken. This low bar tells you a great deal about expectations. Success was survival, with dignity, intact. So, when modern descriptions talk about ancient Greek parties as lively or indulgent, it is worth pausing. They were not wild in the way people imagine. They were controlled environments where excess was carefully rationed, both socially and literally. Wine flowed, but only so far. Speech loosened, but only within bounds. Freedom existed, but it was narrow and watched closely. In the end, an ancient Greek party was less about pleasure and more about rehearsal. Rehearsal for public life, for argument, for maintaining status. You practiced being the kind of person society already expected you to be, just slightly more relaxed, slightly more honest, and slightly more tired. And when it was over, you did not think, that was fun. You thought, I got through it. You went home, lay down properly for the first time that night, and let the quiet return, which, for many guests, was the most enjoyable part of the entire evening. Long after the final lamp was extinguished, the symposium continued to exist in a quieter, more exhausting way. It lived on in memory, in reputation, and in the careful recalculation of where you now stood socially. People did not ask whether you had enjoyed yourself. They asked, indirectly, whether you had embarrassed yourself. Silence the next day was often a good sign. It meant nothing had gone terribly wrong. There was also the slow realization that, for all the talk of wisdom and culture, very little actually changed because of these gatherings. Arguments were repeated from party to party. Positions hardened rather than softened. Everyone left convinced they had performed adequately, which was usually the goal. The symposium did not exist to create new ideas so much as to polish old ones and remind everyone who was allowed to speak them. Hosts took quiet pride in successful evenings. A good host was not remembered for generosity, but for balance. The wine was neither too strong nor too weak. The guests were respectable, but not dull. No one stormed out. No one stayed too long. Achieving this required careful planning and an understanding of human weakness that was rarely acknowledged openly. Hospitality was a form of management. For younger men, these gatherings were educational in the most uncomfortable way possible. You learned when to speak by speaking too early once. You learned restraint by being corrected publicly, but politely. You learned that confidence was acceptable only when backed by status. This was not mentorship, it was exposure therapy. And for those who found the whole thing tedious, there was little escape. Entertainment options were limited. Staying home alone was not celebrated. The symposium filled a social vacuum. It was something to do, somewhere to be, and a way to remind yourself that you belonged to a particular circle. Enjoyment was optional. Attendance was not. It is tempting to imagine moments of genuine laughter breaking through the structure. And surely, occasionally, they did. A joke landed well. A song moved the room briefly. A shared insult created a moment of unity. But these moments were fragile and fleeting. They had to be quickly absorbed back into composure before they became excessive. Too much joy was just another form of losing control. By the time ancient writers later described these parties, they had already been sanitized. The awkward pauses, the forced smiles, the physical discomfort, and the quiet boredom rarely made it into philosophical dialogues. What survived were idealized conversations between calm, articulate men who never spilled wine or struggled to stand up afterward. The messiness was edited out, leaving behind the illusion that these evenings were effortless displays of brilliance. In reality, they were work, social work, intellectual work, emotional work, and like most work, they were tolerated rather than loved. They reinforced norms, rewarded caution, and punished excess. They were safe precisely because they were predictable. So if you had attended an ancient Greek party, you would not have felt transported or liberated. You would have felt watched, measured, and slightly tired. You would have left knowing that nothing remarkable had happened, which was exactly the point. Remarkable things were dangerous. Ordinary endurance was admired. The wine cups would be cleaned, the couches straightened, the room would return to its daytime purpose, and somewhere, someone would quietly decide whether you had been worth inviting again. That, more than the wine or the poetry, was the real outcome of an ancient Greek party. Not memories, not joy, but continued inclusion. And for most people there, that was reason enough to show up, recline carefully, say the right things, and wait patiently for the evening to end. And when you step back far enough, the most striking thing about ancient Greek parties is how carefully they avoided surprise. Nothing truly unexpected was welcome. The guest list was curated, the wine was measured. The topics, though seemingly open, circled familiar ground. Even disagreement followed predictable paths. This was not a space for revelation, it was a space for confirmation. People sometimes imagine these gatherings as places where great ideas were born, but more often they were places where ideas were tested for safety. A thought offered too boldly could be ignored. A challenge pushed too far could be smoothed over with humor. Innovation, if it appeared at all, had to arrive quietly and pretend it had always been there. Radical change did not recline comfortably on a couch. There was also the simple reality of exhaustion. After a full day of managing land, politics, family obligations, or public duties, many guests arrived already tired. Reclining did not mean resting. Listening closely, responding carefully, and maintaining posture required energy. By the later hours, attention drifted. Heads nodded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The party continued largely because stopping it would require someone to admit they were done. Hosts, too, felt relief when the evening ended. Hospitality was a duty, not a pleasure. Opening your home meant opening your reputation to scrutiny. If a guest behaved poorly, it reflected on you. If the wine ran out too soon, you were stingy. If it flowed too freely, you were reckless. Success was invisible. Failure was memorable. In quieter moments, when conversation thinned and cups were refilled more slowly, there may have been a shared awareness that everyone was simply waiting for the acceptable moment to leave, waiting for the night to be over, waiting to return to a life where expectations were clearer and roles were less theatrical. And yet, these parties continued for centuries, not because they were enjoyable, but because they served a function. They reinforced hierarchy, they transmitted values, they reminded participants who belonged and who did not. In a society without many public institutions for casual socializing, the symposium filled an important gap, even if it did so awkwardly. For modern viewers, the disappointment comes from comparison. We hear the word party and imagine release. Ancient Greeks heard it and understood obligation. The same word carries very different weights. What feels like leisure now once felt like responsibility, dressed up with wine and polite conversation. If you were fortunate, you left such a gathering without incident. You were neither praised nor criticized. You blended into the collective memory as someone acceptable. This was the ideal outcome. Standing out was risky. Being remembered too clearly meant you had probably done something wrong. So when history looks back on ancient Greek parties, it does so through softened lenses. The discomfort fades, the boredom disappears. What remains is a tidy image of reclining thinkers and measured wine. But lived experience is rarely tidy. It is slow, imperfect, and quietly draining. In truth, these evenings were less about pleasure than persistence. You showed up, you stayed alert, you endured. And when it was finally over, you returned home to sleep, grateful for silence, grateful to lie flat, and grateful that, for now, your place in the social order remained intact. Which may not sound like much of a party, but for ancient Greece, it was more than enough. Over time, this pattern became so familiar that no one questioned it. The structure of the symposium felt natural, even necessary, precisely because it was predictable. Predictability was comfort. You knew where to recline, when to speak, how much to drink, and when to pretend you were enjoying yourself. In a world with constant uncertainty, this controlled evening offered a narrow sense of stability. There was also the quiet reassurance of sameness. Faces changed slightly from gathering to gathering, but the rhythm remained. The same cups passed from hand to hand. The same arguments resurfaced with minor adjustments. Someone would reference a poet everyone already respected. Someone else would disagree gently, just enough to seem thoughtful. The outcome rarely mattered. Participation did. Silence played an important role too. Not every moment was filled with talk. Long pauses were common, and not always uncomfortable. They allowed guests to rest, to observe, to recalibrate their presence. Silence was not emptiness. It was a signal that nothing urgent needed to be said. In a way, it was the most honest part of the evening. For those watching from the edges, the symposium could look impressive. Reclining figures, lamplight reflecting off polished cups, voices low and deliberate. From the outside, it suggested a society devoted to thought and culture. From the inside, it felt more like maintenance, maintaining image, maintaining hierarchy, maintaining the careful balance between expression and restraint. Occasionally, someone misjudged that balance. A joke went too far. A remark landed awkwardly. A challenge became too sharp. These moments were handled quietly. A change of subject, a refill of wine, a polite smile that closed the matter without resolving it. Conflict was not eliminated. It was smoothed over until it lost momentum. As generations passed, younger men learned to imitate what they saw. They practiced restraint as a skill. They learned that intelligence was as much about timing as content. Speaking at the wrong moment could undo an otherwise clever thought. Waiting patiently often mattered more than originality. The symposium rewarded those who understood this early. And still, despite the discipline, there was a faint undercurrent of relief in being together. Even if the rules were strict, the isolation of staying home alone was worse. Human presence, even formalized, had value. Listening to voices, sharing space, and passing the same cup created a sense of connection that daily labor did not always allow. By the end of the night, fatigue softened everything. Edges dulled. Expectations relaxed slightly. The room settled into a quieter version of itself. Words slowed, movements became careful. Everyone was aware that the evening was winding down, even if no one said so. When guests finally left, the streets outside felt cooler, darker, and strangely empty. The noise of conversation faded quickly, replaced by footsteps and the distant sounds of the city at rest. Walking home, guests may have replayed parts of the evening in their minds, checking for missteps, reassuring themselves that they had done enough and not too much. Sleep, when it came, was uncomplicated. Bodies that had been reclining awkwardly all night welcomed the simplicity of lying flat. Minds that had been performing welcomed silence. Whatever significance the symposium held socially, it dissolved easily in rest. And the next time an invitation arrived, it would be accepted without much thought, not out of excitement, but out of habit, out of understanding that this was how things were done. You showed up, you reclined, you spoke carefully, you endured. Ancient Greek parties were not remembered because they were fun. They were remembered because they were normal. And in a society that valued order above all else, that quiet normality was reason enough to keep repeating the ritual, night after night, lamp after lamp, until history eventually mistook endurance for enjoyment and called it leisure. By the time these rituals became tradition, they no longer needed explanation. No one asked why things were done this way. The format was inherited, like furniture or land, passed down without much reflection. You reclined because others had reclined before you. You drank diluted wine because serious people always had. Questioning the structure would have felt unnecessary, almost impolite, like asking why the sun set when it clearly intended to. There was comfort in that lack of questioning. When behavior is prescribed, responsibility softens. You were not choosing how to act. You were following a pattern. If the evening felt dull, that was not a failure. It was proof that nothing had gone wrong. Excitement was unpredictable. Predictability was safe. Even the language spoken at these gatherings reflected restraint. Statements were often framed carefully, with room to retreat if challenged. Certainty was rare. Ambiguity was admired. Saying, perhaps, or it seems, allowed you to appear thoughtful without committing fully. Strong opinions belonged to public spaces, not reclining rooms lit by oil and expectation. Time itself behaved differently in these settings. Without urgency, minutes blurred together. Conversations drifted, stalled, and resumed without clear transitions. No one checked the hour. The night ended when it felt socially permissible, not when a schedule demanded it. This slow pace reinforced the feeling that nothing needed to be rushed, including enjoyment, which arrived late, if at all. There is also something telling about how little preparation guests were expected to do. You did not bring gifts. You did not contribute food. You brought yourself, clean enough, calm enough, and prepared to participate at a measured level. The host provided everything else, including structure. Guests supplied compliance, and compliance was not passive. It required attention. You listened closely, not because every word mattered, but because missing your cue could be noticed. A delayed response, A poorly timed laugh or an inappropriate silence could mark you as careless. Carelessness suggested a lack of discipline. Discipline was everything. In this way, ancient Greek parties trained people in social awareness. They taught you how to read a room long before the phrase existed. You learned to sense when a topic was tired, when a speaker had gone on too long, when a disagreement needed to dissolve rather than escalate. These were survival skills, learned quietly, one evening at a time. For all its restraint, the symposium was not cruel. It did not punish harshly. Most mistakes were absorbed and forgotten unless repeated. The system favored continuity over drama. You were given many chances to blend in successfully. Standing out required effort and often regret. From a distance, it is easy to romanticize these gatherings as intimate, thoughtful, even cozy. Lamplight has that effect. Reclining figures look peaceful in art, but art removes discomfort. It removes stiffness, boredom, and the faint anxiety of being evaluated. What remains is a still image of calm that never quite existed in motion. If anything, the most honest description of an ancient Greek party is that it was mildly tiring in a socially productive way. You left feeling depleted but intact. You had invested energy and received acceptance in return. That exchange was the real purpose of the night. And so the ritual endured. Night after night, generation after generation, people gathered not to escape their world, but to rehearse their place within it. They spoke softly, drank carefully, reclined properly, and waited for time to pass in a way that felt meaningful enough to justify the effort. In the end, ancient Greek parties were neither joyful nor miserable. They were functional. They did what they were designed to do. They kept society humming quietly, one measured cup at a time, which may be the least exciting definition of a party imaginable, and also the most accurate. If you could attend one today, you would probably stay for a while out of curiosity. You would admire the lamplight, the pottery, the calm voices, and then, without quite knowing why, you would feel the urge to leave early, walk home in silence, and enjoy the simple pleasure of lying down without having to think about how you looked doing it. That quiet relief, more than anything else, would connect you to the ancient guests who came before. They too endured the evening politely, said the right things, and went home grateful that nothing remarkable had happened. And that was enough. And perhaps that is why these gatherings left such a confusing legacy. When later generations looked back, they saw only the outline, not the experience. They saw philosophers reclining in painted scenes and assumed contentment. They read polished dialogues and assumed ease. What they did not see was the effort required to maintain that calm appearance for hours at a time. The symposium rewarded subtlety, not enthusiasm. Passion had to be filtered. Emotion had to be trimmed to an acceptable size. Even admiration was expressed carefully, as too much praise could look like flattery, and flattery suggested weakness. Everything was balanced to avoid extremes. This constant balancing act shaped not only social life, but thought itself. Ideas learned to arrive softly, to sit politely, and to leave without causing disruption. It is difficult to imagine how tiring that becomes over time, not physically exhausting, but mentally so. The mind never fully relaxed. It hovered in a state of alert composure, always aware of how words might land, how gestures might be interpreted. Even laughter had to sound controlled, as if you were amused, but not surprised by your own amusement. This atmosphere made genuine intimacy rare. You could spend entire evenings with the same people and still know very little about them beyond their public selves. Personal struggles, private doubts, and emotional vulnerability did not recline well on couches. They belonged elsewhere, if they belonged anywhere at all. The symposium was not a place for honesty in the modern sense. It was a place for polished presence. And yet, within those limits, bonds still formed. Not deep ones, perhaps, but reliable ones. You knew who could be trusted to behave predictably. You knew who would not embarrass you by association. In a society where reputation traveled quickly and forgiveness slowly, that kind of reliability mattered more than warmth. As the years passed, people learned what to expect from these evenings and adjusted their expectations accordingly. You did not attend hoping to be delighted. You attended hoping to emerge unchanged. The absence of incident became a quiet success. The lack of memory became a form of achievement. There is something almost meditative about that goal, to exist socially without leaving a mark, to participate fully while remaining unremarkable. It runs counter to modern ideas of self-expression, but it made sense in a culture that valued order over individuality. Stability was not boring. It was virtuous. Even the architecture supported this mindset. Rooms were designed to hold bodies in specific arrangements, guiding conversation and eye contact. The physical layout reinforced hierarchy without needing to mention it. Where you reclined mattered. How close you were to the host mattered. Everything spoke quietly, without needing words. When the night finally dissolved, it did so gently. No closing speeches, no dramatic endings, just the gradual thinning of conversation, the subtle shifting of bodies preparing to rise, and the shared understanding that the ritual had run its course. Guests left with polite words and neutral expressions, carrying the evening with them mostly as a sense of completion. The following days absorbed the event easily. Life returned to its routines. Work resumed. Public debates continued. The symposium faded into the background, ready to be repeated when the next invitation arrived. It was not a highlight. It was a rhythm. Looking back now, it is tempting to judge these gatherings as dull or overly rigid, but they were not designed to entertain. They were designed to sustain a particular way of being together. They succeeded by minimizing risk and maximizing continuity. In that sense, they worked very well. If you were dropped into one of these ancient Greek parties today, you might find it quietly fascinating for a time. You would notice the care in language, the slow pace, the absence of urgency, and then, inevitably, you would begin to feel the weight of it. The gentle pressure to behave correctly, the subtle demand to remain composed. Eventually, you would want to leave, not because anything had gone wrong, but because nothing had happened. You would crave silence, space, and the freedom to sit or stand however you pleased. You would step out into the night, breathe cooler air, and feel relief settle in. That feeling, more than wine or philosophy, may be the most authentic connection across centuries. The shared relief of being done, the quiet satisfaction of endurance completed, the knowledge that you had participated, fulfilled your role, and returned home intact. Ancient Greek parties were not celebrations of excess. They were rehearsals of restraint. They did not ask you to lose yourself, only to maintain yourself carefully until the lamps burned low. And when it was over, that was the real reward. Silence, stillness, and the comforting thought that you would not have to recline politely again until the next invitation arrived. And that next invitation, when it came, rarely arrived with excitement. It arrived quietly, as part of routine. A messenger, a brief word, an expectation already understood. You did not ask what kind of evening it would be. You already knew. The predictability was the message. By this point in life, most regular guests had perfected a kind of social autopilot. Their bodies reclined without thought. Their responses surfaced automatically. They nodded at familiar points, smiled faintly at familiar jokes, and offered safe observations that neither challenged nor impressed too much. This was not hypocrisy. It was efficiency. Energy was conserved for places where it mattered more. There is something almost bureaucratic about that rhythm. The symposium functioned like a social office, open after dark. Attendance maintained your position. Absence required explanation. Performance was evaluated quietly and continuously, without formal records, but with long memories. You did not rise through brilliance alone. You rose through consistency. Occasionally, a guest would try to disrupt this balance. A dramatic statement, a provocative argument, a sudden display of emotion. These moments created a ripple of attention, followed by discomfort. The room would adjust quickly, either absorbing the disruption or gently isolating it. The message was clear without being spoken. Extremes were tolerated briefly, but not encouraged. What is striking is how little space there was for spontaneity. Modern parties often rely on surprise to create enjoyment. Ancient Greek parties avoided surprise entirely. Surprise meant loss of control, and loss of control threatened the social fabric. The evening was designed to unfold exactly as expected, from the first diluted cup to the final polite farewell. Even humor followed this logic. Jokes were clever, restrained, and often familiar. They played on shared references rather than shock. Laughter was allowed, but not the kind that bent bodies or broke posture. The ideal reaction was recognition, not release. You smiled because you understood, not because you were overwhelmed. Over time, this shaped what people thought enjoyment looked like. Pleasure became subtle, satisfaction became quiet. The absence of conflict felt like success. The absence of embarrassment felt like happiness. If joy appeared at all, it did so briefly and privately, careful not to disturb the surface. It is easy to underestimate how much discipline this required. Not discipline enforced by punishment, but discipline maintained by awareness. You watched yourself constantly. You adjusted tone, timing, posture. You participated in a shared performance of calm that only worked if everyone agreed to keep it intact. And yet, despite all this restraint, the symposium was not empty. It had meaning precisely because it asked something of you. It required effort, attention, and patience. It reminded you that belonging was not automatic. It was maintained through repeated, careful participation. For some, that effort felt worthwhile. For others, it felt unavoidable. But either way, it shaped the social landscape. Relationships were built slowly, trust measured over time, reputations formed through accumulation rather than moments. Nothing happened quickly, and that was the point. When historians later described ancient Greek culture as measured, rational, and orderly, they were not wrong, but those qualities were not abstract ideals. They were practiced nightly, in rooms filled with oil smoke, stiff cushions, and men doing their best not to stand out. So when you imagine an ancient Greek party now, it may help to adjust the image. Remove the laughter echoing through marble halls. Remove the sense of carefree indulgence. Replace it with something quieter. A room of people reclining carefully, speaking slowly, watching each other just enough, and waiting for the night to pass without incident. That waiting was not empty. It was filled with small calculations, subtle signals, and the shared understanding that this was how social life worked. You showed up, you endured, you maintained your place. And when you finally left, walking home under a dark, quiet sky, the relief you felt was not disappointment. It was completion. You had done what was required. Nothing more, nothing less. Ancient Greek parties were not about escaping the world. They were about confirming it. They reminded everyone present that order mattered, restraint was admired, and survival, social survival, depended on knowing exactly how much of yourself to show, which may not sound like much of a party. But for them, it was enough to keep the night occupied, the hierarchy intact, and the lamps burning steadily, until it was finally, mercifully, time to go home and lie down without thinking about it at all. And after enough of these evenings, something subtle happened. The symposium stopped feeling like an event at all and became more like weather. It was simply there, recurring, predictable, shaping behavior without demanding attention. You adjusted to it the way you adjusted to seasons. You did not celebrate it. You endured it politely and planned around it. People learned how to manage their energy across the night. You spoke early if you wanted to be noticed, when minds were sharper and cups lighter. Later, you conserved words. Silence became a tool rather than a risk. By the end, simply remaining upright and attentive counted as participation. Expectations softened as fatigue settled in, which was perhaps the most generous part of the evening. There was also the quiet awareness that these gatherings were finite, not just nightly, but historically. Cities rose and fell. Wars interrupted routines. Invitations stopped arriving for reasons that had nothing to do with your behavior. In that sense, every symposium carried a faint undertone of impermanence, even if no one mentioned it. Traditions feel solid until they suddenly are not. Still, while they lasted, they shaped how people thought about time well spent. Productivity was not measured in outcomes, but in presence. You had been there. You had taken part. That was enough to justify the hours. Modern ideas of efficiency would have felt strange in such a room. Efficiency implied haste. Haste implied carelessness. Care was the true currency of the symposium. Care in speech, care in posture, care in timing, even care in boredom. To appear bored openly would have suggested that you considered yourself above the ritual, which was far worse than being quietly uninterested. The correct response to tedium was composure. As age advanced, some guests found comfort in this predictability. They no longer needed to impress. Familiarity softened the edges. Younger men performed more. Older men observed. The room adjusted naturally, without formal acknowledgement. Experience spoke through restraint. And for those who eventually stopped attending, either through age, illness, or loss of relevance, the absence was not dramatic. Life simply narrowed. Evenings grew quieter. The lamps at home felt dimmer, but also easier. No one reclined incorrectly. No one waited for the right moment to speak. Silence became less strategic and more genuine. Looking back, it is possible that some guests remembered these parties with a kind of fond neutrality, not because they were joyful, but because they were shared. Shared boredom still counts as connection. Shared endurance creates familiarity. There is comfort in knowing others are enduring the same thing at the same time. That may be the most human aspect of ancient Greek parties. Beneath the rules, the hierarchy, and the restraint, there was a simple act of gathering. People came together in a world that offered few opportunities to pause. They slowed down collectively, even if they did not fully relax. When history compresses centuries into neat summaries, it often misses these textures. It turns lived experience into ideals. Rationality replaces routine. Leisure replaces obligation. But daily life is rarely ideal. It is repetitive, negotiated, and mildly uncomfortable. The symposium reflected that truth more accurately than the polished words it later produced. So, if you imagine yourself there, try not to imagine excitement. Imagine instead the weight of the cup in your hand, the low murmur of voices, the steady flicker of lamplight. Imagine adjusting your position slightly, waiting for the right moment to speak, deciding it can wait, and letting the moment pass. That was most of the night. And when it finally ended, there was no applause, no sense of climax, just the slow unwinding of bodies from couches, the careful exchange of farewells, and the quiet return to streets that felt refreshingly empty. Home offered darkness, stillness, and the freedom to stop performing. In that moment, lying flat at last, you may have felt something close to contentment, not because the party had been good, but because it was over. You had participated, you had maintained your place, you had endured another small cycle of social life. Ancient Greek parties were not remembered because they dazzled, they were remembered because they repeated. They taught people how to exist together without chaos, how to fill time without urgency, and how to leave without consequence. And in a world where survival often depended on restraint, that quiet lesson mattered far more than fun ever could. And eventually, even that sense of endurance softened into something like routine acceptance. The symposium no longer felt demanding, because expectations had been fully absorbed. You did not brace yourself for the evening. You simply adjusted your day around it, the way you adjusted around meals or sleep. It was part of the background architecture of life, always there, rarely questioned. At this stage, memory itself became vague. Individual gatherings blurred together. You remembered faces more than nights, patterns more than moments. Trying to recall a specific symposium would likely produce only fragments. The curve of a cup, a line of poetry half remembered, the sound of someone clearing their throat before speaking. Nothing dramatic stood out, and that was precisely why the system functioned so smoothly. The city outside continued its own rhythms, while these rooms filled and emptied. Merchants closed stalls, animals settled, streets quieted. Inside, men reclined and spoke carefully, largely insulated from the noise and unpredictability beyond the walls. The symposium was a controlled pocket of calm in a world that offered very little of it. It is easy to forget how rare such controlled social spaces were. Most interactions in ancient life were practical, hurried, or tense. Work demanded attention. Public life demanded performance. The symposium, for all its restraint, offered something slightly different. It allowed time to slow down, not to stop, but to stretch. That slowness alone had value, even if it came wrapped in obligation. For some guests, especially those nearing the end of their public lives, these evenings may have felt almost comforting. The rules were familiar. The stakes were lower than they once had been. You were no longer trying to prove yourself. You were simply present, allowed to occupy space without urgency. In a culture that prized productivity and reputation, that quiet permission mattered. Of course, none of this meant the symposium was universally liked. Many likely attended out of habit alone. Some may have dreaded it, but dread, too, can become routine. When something is unavoidable, you stop reacting emotionally and start managing practically. You plan your energy. You decide how much of yourself to bring. You learn how to leave intact. And leave intact was always the goal. Not inspired, not transformed, intact. The symposium did not promise revelation. It promised continuity. You arrived as yourself and, ideally, departed the same way, with no damage done to your standing or your relationships. If that sounds modest, it is because ancient social success often was. Survival depended on minimizing risk. Standing out too much invited scrutiny. Blending in ensured safety. The symposium rewarded those who understood this and punished those who resisted it, not loudly, but persistently. Over time, this shaped not only behavior, but expectation. People stopped looking for joy in these gatherings. They looked instead for confirmation. Confirmation that they were still included, still acceptable, still part of the network that mattered. That confirmation did not require pleasure. It required presence. In this way, ancient Greek parties were less about celebration than reassurance. Reassurance that the social order still held, that familiar faces were still familiar, that nothing had shifted too dramatically since the last time everyone reclined together under lamplight. And perhaps that is why these gatherings left such a strong imprint on historical imagination. They produced texts, dialogues, and scenes that looked calm, measured, and thoughtful. They created the appearance of a society at ease with itself. What those records rarely show is the effort required to maintain that appearance night after night. The effort was quiet. It did not announce itself. It looked like patience. It sounded like careful phrasing. It felt like staying just a little longer than you wanted to, and leaving just before it became awkward. It was not heroic. It was human. If you were to attend one of these ancient Greek parties today, stripped of romantic expectation, you might understand it more clearly. You would not ask whether it was fun. You would ask whether it made sense, whether it fit the world it belonged to. And the answer would probably be yes. It made sense in a culture that valued restraint over expression, continuity over disruption, and survival over delight. It made sense in a world where social bonds were maintained through repetition rather than passion. It made sense because it worked, and when it ended, as it always did, you would not carry it with you as a memory. You would carry it as a feeling of closure. Another obligation met. Another evening passed without incident. Another quiet confirmation that, for now, everything remained in its proper place. You would lie down, finally free of posture and performance, and let the stillness settle. The room would be dark, the city quiet. Tomorrow would arrive as usual. And somewhere, not far away, someone else would be preparing oil lamps, arranging couches, and getting ready to repeat the same careful ritual once again. Not because it was enjoyable, but because it was necessary. And that sense of necessity was rarely questioned, because questioning it would have required imagining an alternative. Ancient Greek society did not offer many. Social life did not branch into endless options. There were no casual gatherings without meaning, no evenings that existed purely to pass time without consequence. Almost everything you did was observed, remembered, and folded back into your reputation. The symposium was simply the most organized version of that reality. Over time, people learned how to be efficient participants. They arrived neither too early nor too late. They positioned themselves carefully. They listened with the right amount of attention. They spoke when expected and withheld when uncertain. None of this felt remarkable. It felt practical. You learned these skills the way you learned to walk crowded streets or negotiate public spaces. They were part of surviving politely. What is easy to miss is how much of this depended on mutual restraint. The system only worked because everyone agreed, implicitly, to maintain it. Hosts did not push guests too far. Guests did not test hosts unnecessarily. Everyone accepted the limits of the evening. This shared agreement created stability, but it also created a ceiling. Nothing could rise too high. Nothing could fall too low. That ceiling shaped culture itself. Philosophy became measured. Art became balanced. Public speech favored structure over spontaneity. The habits practiced at these gatherings echoed outward into broader life. Calm debate replaced emotional outburst. Form replaced impulse. The symposium was not just a social event, it was a training ground. And like most training, it was repetitive. You did the same thing many times, not to enjoy it, but to become reliable at it. Reliability mattered. It made you predictable, and predictability made you safe. In a world where power shifted quickly and forgiveness was limited, being safe was valuable. There is a quiet irony in how later generations admired these gatherings as symbols of intellectual freedom. From the inside, freedom was tightly bounded. You were free to speak, but only within an acceptable range. You were free to drink, but only in moderation. You were free to disagree, but not too sharply. Freedom existed, but it was domesticated. Still, people adapted. Humans are good at adapting to constraints. Within the narrow space allowed, they found small comforts. A familiar face across the room, a predictable rhythm of conversation, the reassurance that nothing dramatic was about to happen. For some, that was enough to make the evening tolerable. For a few, it may have even been comforting. As age progressed, ambition softened. Younger men worried about being noticed. Older men worried less. The same symposium meant different things at different stages of life. What once felt like pressure eventually felt like background noise. The couches grew more familiar. The conversations less urgent. The need to impress faded quietly. Eventually, participation itself became optional, though not officially. Attendance declined gradually, without ceremony. Invitations arrived less often. Names disappeared from guest lists. Life narrowed, not because of exclusion, but because of time. And with that narrowing came a different kind of quiet. Fewer performances, fewer calculations, less need to manage perception. For those who reached that stage, the symposium may have seemed distant, almost unreal, like a long habit broken without much notice. It had occupied so many evenings, required so much attention, and then simply stopped. The world did not collapse. Life continued. That realization alone might have been unsettling. Looking back, it becomes clear that ancient Greek parties were never meant to be memorable experiences. They were meant to be stabilizing forces. They held society together through repetition, not excitement. They smoothed differences, reinforced expectations, and taught people how to exist in close proximity without friction. From a modern perspective, this can feel disappointing. We often look to the past hoping to find lost joy or freedom. What we find instead is structure, caution, and quiet endurance. But that does not make these gatherings meaningless. It makes them honest reflections of the world they belong to. Ancient Greek life was not built around pleasure. It was built around balance. Too much of anything was dangerous. Too little invited neglect. The symposium sat carefully in the middle, offering just enough stimulation to matter and just enough restraint to keep order intact. So, when you hear about ancient Greek parties, it may help to replace the word party with something else. Think of them as rehearsals, or maintenance, or scheduled calm. They were evenings designed not to thrill, but to hold things steady. And they did that very well. Night after night, people reclined, spoke, listened, drank carefully, and waited for time to pass in a socially acceptable way. They left when it was safe to do so. They slept, they woke, they repeated the pattern when called upon. There was no grand finale, no sense of completion beyond the quiet knowledge that nothing had gone wrong. In the end, that was the real success of an ancient Greek party. It did not change your life. It did not excite you. It did not exhaust you beyond recovery. It simply happened. And in a world where stability was rare and risk was constant, that small, unremarkable outcome was worth repeating for centuries. And perhaps the clearest sign that these gatherings were not about enjoyment is how easily they blended into everything else. They did not interrupt life. They fit neatly into it. You did not rearrange your identity to attend a symposium. You simply adjusted your posture and vocabulary for a few hours, and then returned to whatever you had been before. Nothing about the evening encouraged forgetting yourself. In fact, the opposite was true. You were constantly reminded of who you were, where you stood, and how closely others were watching. Even the act of drinking was a reminder of limits. Too little suggested stiffness. Too much suggested weakness. The correct amount was never announced. You learned it slowly, by observing consequences. This made the symposium an exercise in calibration. You calibrated your speech to the room, your tone to the moment, your opinions to the people reclining nearby. You watched reactions carefully, not because you were insecure, but because this was how social navigation worked. Awareness was survival. Comfort came later, if at all. What is striking is how much patience this required. Modern gatherings often reward immediacy. Say something interesting quickly, make an impression. Ancient Greek parties rewarded delay. Waiting was not wasted time. It was proof of discipline. Speaking last could be more impressive than speaking first, especially if nothing new needed to be said. That patience extended to the entire structure of the evening. There was no rush toward a climax, no moment everyone waited for. The night unfolded evenly, like a long sentence that never quite ended. This lack of narrative made the experience feel endless at times, but also oddly safe. Nothing surprising was likely to happen, and that was reassuring. For guests who valued order, this predictability had its appeal. Life outside the symposium was unpredictable. Weather, politics, illness, and war interrupted plans without warning. Inside the lamplit room, the rules held. Conversation followed patterns. Time slowed. The world felt briefly manageable. Still, manageability does not equal pleasure. Many guests likely counted the hours quietly, waiting for the moment when departure became socially acceptable. Leaving too soon raised questions. Leaving too late raised others. The correct exit required sensitivity, timing, and the ability to read subtle cues. This, too, was a skill refined over many evenings. Once outside, the contrast was immediate. Streets were darker, quieter, less demanding. You could walk without being evaluated. You could think without framing your thoughts for an audience. You could exist without performance. That transition alone may have been one of the most noticeable parts of the night. At home, there were no couches to recline on properly, no cups to hold carefully, no one watching how much you spoke or how quietly you laughed. The body relaxed in ways it had not been allowed to all evening. The mind followed. Whatever the symposium had offered, relief came only after it was over. This does not mean the symposium failed. It did exactly what it was meant to do. It provided a structured environment where social bonds could be maintained without chaos. It reinforced norms without open enforcement. It allowed people to see and be seen without encouraging excess. Over generations, these repeated evenings shaped habits so deeply that they became invisible. People did not think of themselves as performing restraint. They simply behaved correctly. The performance disappeared into routine, which is how the most powerful systems operate. They stop feeling imposed and start feeling natural. When modern historians describe ancient Greek society as balanced and rational, they are partly describing the outcome of countless such evenings. Calm did not emerge spontaneously. It was practiced, night after night, in rooms filled with oil, smoke, and cautious conversation. The symposium was one of the quiet engines behind that image. If you were expecting joy, you would be disappointed. If you were expecting safety, you would understand the appeal. These gatherings were not designed to lift spirits. They were designed to keep things steady. In a world that punished mistakes harshly, steadiness was valuable. So, when we imagine ancient Greek parties today, it may help to lower expectations, remove the laughter, the music, the sense of release, replace it with something slower and more deliberate. A room of people reclining carefully, speaking in turns, watching each other with mild interest and constant awareness. Nothing explodes, nothing collapses, time passes, and when it ends, everyone leaves, more or less as they arrived, slightly tired, slightly relieved, socially intact. That was the success of an ancient Greek party. Not that it thrilled anyone, but that it did not cause trouble. And in that world, that was more than enough reason to keep showing up, cup in hand, ready to recline once again and quietly wait for the night to do what it always did, which was pass. And in that passing of the night, there was a kind of unspoken agreement that nothing more was required. No follow-up, no reflection, no emotional processing. The symposium did not ask you to grow, change, or feel deeply. It asked only that you remain appropriate until the lamps burned low and the conversation thinned into polite murmurs. That expectation shaped how people measured a successful evening. Success was quiet. It meant no raised voices, no visible discomfort, no story worth repeating the next day. If someone asked how the night went, the safest answer was something vague and neutral. It was fine. Fine was ideal. Fine meant stable. Over years of repetition, this quiet neutrality became comforting. When life elsewhere was harsh, unpredictable, or loud, the symposium offered a predictable dullness. You knew what would happen. You knew what would not. In a strange way, boredom itself became a luxury. It meant nothing urgent was wrong. There was also something reassuring about shared boredom. Everyone in the room was enduring the same slow hours, the same careful phrasing, the same low-grade fatigue. No one was being entertained, but no one was being excluded either. That shared endurance created a subtle bond, even if it was never named. And because nothing dramatic happened, nothing needed to be remembered. Memory, in this case, was a burden avoided. Events that mattered were dangerous. They carried consequences. The symposium aimed for forgettability. If you forgot most of the evening by the next morning, it had done its job perfectly. This is why so many descriptions of ancient Greek parties feel strangely empty. They lack emotion because emotion was not the goal. They lack detail because detail was not encouraged. What mattered was the structure, not the experience inside it. The shape of the night mattered more than what filled it. For modern readers, this can feel disappointing. We want to believe that the past was either more joyful or more dramatic than the present. The reality is often quieter. People then, like people now, spent much of their time maintaining routines that made life manageable rather than exciting. The symposium was one of those routines. It absorbed time. It absorbed social tension. It absorbed the need for connection in a controlled way. It did not solve problems. It kept them from becoming visible. If you imagine attending one of these gatherings late in its lifespan, centuries after the format had settled, you might notice how automatic everything felt. No one explained the rules because everyone already knew them. No one tested the boundaries because the boundaries were internalized. The evening moved forward on habit alone. That habit is what allowed the tradition to persist, not enthusiasm, not pleasure. Habit. Habit is powerful because it requires no justification. You do things because they have always been done. You recline because others recline. You speak carefully because careful speech is expected. The system sustains itself. And then, eventually, it doesn't. Traditions fade not because they fail, but because circumstances change. Cities grow, empires shift, new forms of gathering replace old ones. The symposium quietly recedes, leaving behind texts, images, and misunderstandings. What remains is the idea of ancient Greek parties as intellectual playgrounds, when in reality they were more like social treadmills. You walked steadily, went nowhere, and stopped when allowed. The value was not in the destination, but in staying on without falling. So if you are still imagining music, laughter, and release, it may be time to let that go. Replace it with something slower and softer. The low hum of conversation, the steady flicker of oil lamps, the mild discomfort of reclining too long, the quiet calculation of when it would be acceptable to leave. That was the experience. And when it finally ended, as all nights do, there was no sense of loss, only relief. Relief that you had fulfilled another small obligation without incident. Relief that tomorrow would arrive as expected. Relief that, for now, your place in the world remained unchanged. Ancient Greek parties were not celebrations of life. They were confirmations of order. They reminded everyone, gently but persistently, how to behave, how to belong, and how to endure together without drawing attention. And then they faded into the dark, leaving behind nothing more than a quiet room, extinguished lamps, and the familiar comfort of silence, which, for many guests, was the most satisfying part of the entire evening. And if that makes these parties sound dull, that is because they were meant to be, quietly, deliberately, and successfully so. And even that silence at the end had its own etiquette. You did not rush into it. You earned it by staying long enough, by waiting patiently until the evening had clearly expired. Leaving before the room itself seemed tired could look disrespectful, as if you had decided your own comfort mattered more than the shared ritual. Endurance was noticed, even when nothing else was. Over time, this created a peculiar relationship with pleasure. Pleasure was something to be moderated, managed, and kept private. Enjoyment that showed too clearly became suspicious. Why were you enjoying this so much? What were you gaining from it? The safest form of satisfaction was subtle, barely visible, and quickly swallowed back down. This attitude extended beyond the symposium and into daily life. Restraint was not just a social skill, it was a moral one. A person who could control themselves in a reclining room filled with wine could be trusted elsewhere. The party was less a reward than a test, quietly repeated, with no official results posted. There is a temptation to think that this constant moderation must have been exhausting. In some ways, it was, but in other ways, it simplified things. When rules are clear and narrow, decision-making shrinks. You do not wonder how to behave. You already know. The cost is spontaneity. The benefit is security. Many guests likely learn to appreciate that security with age. Youth notices constraint. Age notices stability. What once felt limiting later feels protective. The symposium did not demand creativity or emotional risk. It demanded consistency. And consistency is easier to maintain as ambition fades. For those who never quite fit, the experience was probably more draining. Misreading a cue, mistiming a comment, or failing to mirror the room's tone could create a quiet sense of exclusion, not enough to be obvious, just enough to be felt. The symposium did not punish loudly. It adjusted subtly. And yet, despite all this, people kept coming, not because they loved it, but because it was where social life happened. To be absent was to drift toward invisibility. Presence, even dull presence, mattered. Being seen reclining correctly was better than not being seen at all. This makes the symposium feel less like a party and more like maintenance of existence. You showed up to remind others you still existed in the correct way. You stayed long enough to confirm it. You left when the ritual allowed. The system continued. When modern audiences hear about ancient Greek gatherings, they often imagine passion restrained by philosophy. The reality was closer to philosophy restrained by routine. Big ideas existed, but they arrived cautiously, padded by politeness and timing. The environment shaped thought as much as thought shaped the environment. Nothing about this made the evenings memorable in a joyful sense, but they were memorable structurally. They taught generations how to behave under observation, how to speak without committing, How to belong without revealing too much. These lessons outlasted any individual night, and perhaps that is why, centuries later, these gatherings still fascinate, not because they look fun, but because they reveal something uncomfortable and familiar. That much of social life, across time, is not about enjoyment. It is about navigation, about learning where to place yourself and how to stay there without drawing attention. If you imagine sitting through one of these ancient Greek parties from beginning to end, stripped of romance, you might feel a creeping sense of recognition, the careful talk, the polite boredom, the relief when it ends. These are not foreign feelings. They are deeply human ones. We may dress them differently now. We may call our gatherings other names, but the underlying experience remains. Showing up when expected, saying the right amount, waiting for time to pass, leaving at the correct moment, hoping nothing went wrong. In that sense, ancient Greek parties were not strange at all. They were early versions of something very familiar, a social space designed not to thrill, but to regulate, not to liberate, but to reassure, not to be remembered, but to be repeated. And so the lamps burned, the cups were passed, the couches filled and emptied, again and again, night after night, generation after generation, until eventually, history condensed all that quiet endurance into a handful of elegant images and thoughtful words, and forgot the long, mild discomfort in between, which is understandable. The discomfort was never the point. The point was that everyone stayed, and that, for ancient Greek parties, was more than enough. And staying, in the end, was the clearest signal of loyalty to the system. You stayed even when your back ached from reclining. You stayed when the conversation circled familiar ground for the third time. You stayed because leaving early suggested impatience, and impatience suggested a lack of self-control. Self-control, above all else, was the virtue being quietly measured. It is worth noticing how little individuality mattered in this setting. Personal taste was irrelevant. You did not attend because you preferred this host or that topic. You attended because attendance itself was the point. The symposium was not curated for delight. It was standardized for stability. Like a well-worn road, it existed to be used, not admired. This standardization made everything feel interchangeable. One evening resembled the next. One guest resembled another. Distinctions blurred, not because people were identical, but because difference was carefully flattened. Sharp edges were smoothed, loud voices softened, strong emotions diluted, much like the wine itself. Nothing was meant to stand out too clearly. And yet, beneath that flattening, everyone remained alert to small signals. A pause held slightly too long, a joke that landed a bit off, a disagreement that edged closer to sincerity than was comfortable. These were noticed, catalogued, and quietly remembered. The symposium may have looked calm, but it was never inattentive. This constant low-level attention created a peculiar mental state. You were relaxed, but not at ease, comfortable, but not free, present, but not fully yourself. The body reclined, but the mind hovered, always half aware of the room. It was not stressful enough to exhaust you immediately. It was just demanding enough to wear you down slowly. Over years, that wear became normal. You stopped expecting anything else. Social life simply felt like this, measured, watched, slightly tiring. When younger people complained, older ones likely responded with quiet confusion. This was how it had always been. What was there to complain about? And perhaps that acceptance is the most revealing detail of all. People rarely rebelled against these gatherings because they did not experience them as oppression. They experienced them as reality. The rules were not imposed from outside. They were absorbed from within. By the time you noticed them, they already felt natural. That is why ancient Greek parties left so little emotional record. No diaries of boredom, no complaints about sore backs or tired minds. Not because those things did not exist, but because they were not considered noteworthy. Enduring them was simply part of being an adult participant in society. When the lamps went out and the room emptied, nothing dramatic followed. No sense of having missed out, no longing for more. Just the quiet transition back to private life, where posture could relax and thoughts could wander without supervision. That contrast, subtle but real, marked the boundary between public composure and personal relief. If anything, the symposium made that relief sharper. Silence at home felt deeper after hours of managed conversation. Stillness felt richer after careful restraint. Sleep came easily, not because the evening had been pleasant, but because it had been demanding in a gentle, persistent way. And then the cycle reset. Another day of work, another evening somewhere else, another room prepared with couches and lamps, another invitation accepted without excitement or resistance, another night of reclining, listening, speaking just enough, and waiting for time to move forward without incident. This repetition did not produce stories worth retelling. It produced a society that knew how to sit together without falling apart. That may not sound glamorous, it may not sound fun, but it was effective. And effectiveness, in that world, mattered far more than enjoyment. So when we talk about ancient Greek parties, it helps to let go of the word party entirely. What existed was something quieter and more disciplined, a social mechanism, a nightly rehearsal of restraint, a way of being together that valued continuity over pleasure. Nothing exploded, nothing transformed. People arrived, people stayed, people left. The world remained intact. And that was the success. Not laughter echoing through marble halls, not wild nights remembered forever. Just the steady, unremarkable passing of another evening, handled correctly. For ancient Greece, that was enough. And for anyone lying awake tonight, listening to this and slowly drifting off, it may sound familiar. Not exciting, not dramatic. Just a reminder that much of history, like much of life, was made up of people quietly doing what was expected, waiting patiently for the night to end, and finding comfort, at last, in the simple act of rest. And that act of rest, when it finally arrived, was uncomplicated in a way the evening had not been. No one watched how you lay down. No one measured the tone of your thoughts. The body simply settled, grateful to be free of posture and presentation. In that quiet, whatever meaning the symposium claimed faded quickly. Sleep erased hierarchy far more effectively than wine ever could. It is tempting to think that people must have complained about these gatherings in private. Perhaps they did. Perhaps someone sighed when an invitation arrived, knowing exactly how the night would unfold. But complaint requires comparison, and comparison requires alternatives. For most of ancient Greek history, there were few. The symposium was not competing with anything more relaxed. It was the option. That scarcity of alternatives shaped tolerance. When there is only one way to gather, you adapt to it. You learn to find small comforts inside narrow rules. You notice the warmth of lamplight on stone walls. You appreciate the predictability of familiar voices. You take satisfaction in navigating the evening without misstep. These were modest rewards, but they were real. Over time, even the mild discomfort became familiar. Reclining awkwardly stopped feeling strange. Diluted wine tasted normal. Long pauses in conversation felt expected rather than awkward. The body and mind adjusted together. What once required effort became habit, and habit softened resistance. This is how cultures persist, not through enthusiasm, but through normalization. The symposium endured because it did not ask too much. It demanded attention, but not passion. It required presence, but not belief. You did not have to love it. You only had to participate correctly. And participation itself became a kind of proof. Proof that you understood the rules. Proof that you belonged. Proof that you could be trusted to manage yourself. These proofs mattered in a society where trust was built slowly and lost easily. A man who could not manage himself at a symposium was unlikely to be trusted elsewhere. Seen this way, the evening was less leisure than training. Training in restraint, timing, and observation. Training in how to exist among others without creating disturbance. The couches and cups were props. The real work happened quietly, inside each guest, as they calibrated themselves to the room. That calibration never ended. Even as fatigue set in, awareness remained. You noticed when the host shifted slightly. You noticed when conversation slowed. You noticed when it became acceptable to leave. These signals were subtle, but missing them had consequences. The symposium taught you to read the unspoken, a skill that extended far beyond the room. If this sounds draining, it was. But it was a slow drain, spread across hours, softened by routine. It did not shock the system. It wore it down gently, in a way that felt manageable. You did not collapse afterward. You simply slept deeply. And then you woke, and life resumed. The symposium did not linger emotionally. It did not haunt you. It sat quietly in the background of your life, one of many small obligations that together made up adulthood. You did not look forward to it. You did not dread it. You accepted it. This acceptance is what later generations often misunderstand. They search for excitement in the past because excitement photographs well. It writes well. Endurance does not. Endurance leaves few traces, precisely because it is ordinary. The symposium was ordinary, repeated, and designed to fade into routine. So, when you imagine ancient Greek parties now, Imagine them as people likely experienced them most of the time, not as highlights, not as disasters, just as evenings that needed to be handled correctly. Evenings that asked for attention, patience, and restraint, and offered, in return, the right to remain part of the social fabric. Nothing more dramatic than that. And perhaps that is the most honest way to understand them, not as lost moments of joy, but as carefully managed stretches of time, time filled with talk, silence, wine, and waiting. Time that passed slowly, evenly, without surprise. In a world where survival depended on fitting in as much as standing out, those slow, even hours mattered. They kept people connected. They kept conflict contained. They kept society functioning, one quiet night at a time. Eventually, of course, history moved on. New forms of gathering replaced old ones. Different rules emerged. The symposium became an idea rather than a routine, but for centuries, it was simply what people did when the day ended and the lamps were lit. They reclined. They listened. They spoke carefully. They waited. And when it was finally over, they went home, lay down properly at last, and let the stillness do what it always does. It carried them into sleep, which, for anyone listening now, may be the most accurate legacy of ancient Greek parties after all. And carried into that sleep, the evening lost whatever shape it once had. Words dissolved first. Faces followed. What remained was only a vague sense of having been somewhere, of having done what was required. By morning, even that faded. The symposium did not demand to be remembered. It was content to disappear quietly. This vanishing act was not accidental. The structure of the gathering discouraged attachment. You were not meant to leave inspired or transformed. You were meant to leave unchanged. The symposium functioned best when it left no trace strong enough to disturb the next day. Life continued. Duties resumed. The night folded neatly into routine. In this way, ancient Greek parties trained people not to expect emotional payoff from social obligations. You did not attend hoping to feel something new. You attended because attendance itself was the currency. Showing up, staying long enough, leaving correctly. That was the exchange. Expecting more would have only led to disappointment. There is something quietly sobering about that expectation. It suggests a society comfortable with restraint, even resigned to it. Joy was not absent, but it was not central. Stability came first. Harmony mattered more than excitement. In a world where political shifts, war, and scarcity were constant threats, predictability was a form of safety. The symposium offered that safety in a controlled dose. It gathered people together without letting them collide too forcefully. It allowed speech without chaos, drink without loss, proximity without intimacy. Everything was moderated, measured, and contained. Nothing overflowed for long. This containment shaped how people related to one another. Bonds were built slowly, through repeated exposure rather than shared vulnerability. Trust accumulated through consistency, not confession. You learned who someone was by watching how they behaved over many evenings, not by what they revealed in one. The symposium rewarded patience, and patience, once learned, spread. It influenced public debate, legal proceedings, and daily interaction. Speaking carefully at night made speaking carefully during the day easier. Restraining emotion in private spaces reinforced restraint in public ones. The boundary between social ritual and civic behavior blurred quietly. This may be why ancient Greek culture often appears composed in retrospect. That composure was practiced. Night after night, people rehearsed it under lamplight, adjusting themselves to the expectations of others. The symposium was one of the places where that rehearsal happened most reliably. Of course, none of this made the evenings lively. But liveliness was not the goal. The goal was continuation. A society that could sit together without imploding had an advantage. It could argue without collapsing. It could drink without losing itself. It could endure. From the outside, this can feel cold. From the inside, it may have felt necessary. People adapted to the conditions they lived in. They found meaning not in intensity, but in repetition. Not in release, but in control. These values were not imposed by philosophers alone. They were reinforced by habit. The symposium was habit made visible, a ritual that asked little and offered little, but did so consistently. It did not promise pleasure. It promised order, and in exchange for that order, it asked for attention, restraint, and time. Time, above all else, was what it consumed. Hours passed slowly on those couches. Conversations stretched thin. Silence filled the gaps. And still, people stayed. They stayed because staying was expected, and expectation carried weight. If you imagine yourself there now, At the far end of one of these evenings, you might feel the room settling, voices quieter, cups lighter, the sense that nothing more needs to be said. Someone shifts, preparing to leave, another follows. The ritual unwinds gently. No one marks the moment. It simply happens. You step outside. The air is cooler. The street is calm. Your body straightens instinctively, relieved to stand freely. The night feels wider than the room you just left. For the first time in hours, no one is watching how you hold yourself. That relief is subtle, but real. It does not feel like joy. It feels like release from effort, from attention, from calculation. You walk home without speaking, without performing, without measuring your words. By the time you lie down, the symposium is already fading. Tomorrow, it will not matter. Another invitation may come. You will accept it. You will recline again. The cycle will repeat. Not because it excites you, but because it holds things together. And that, in the quiet arithmetic of ancient life, was reason enough. And holding things together was an achievement that rarely announced itself. There were no celebrations for stability, no monuments to evenings that passed without incident. The success of the symposium lay precisely in how invisible it became. When something works quietly, people stop noticing it. They only notice when it fails. Failure, when it did occur, was uncomfortable rather than dramatic. Someone spoke too sharply. Someone drank too much. Someone revealed an emotion that did not fit the room. These moments were not punished loudly. They were absorbed, corrected, and remembered just enough to influence future invitations. The system adjusted without explanation. Order reasserted itself. Most guests, learned from watching others, make these mistakes. Observation was constant. You learned not by instruction, but by example. You noticed who was interrupted and who was allowed to finish. You noticed whose jokes were ignored. You noticed who stopped being invited. These lessons were quiet but effective. Because of this, the symposium shaped behavior without ever naming its rules. No one stood up to say, "This is how we behave here." Everyone already knew, and those who did not learned quickly or faded from view. The room taught without speaking, which is often the most efficient way to teach. It is easy to imagine that, over time, some people found ways to enjoy these evenings within their limits. A familiar voice, a predictable exchange, a sense of belonging that came not from intimacy, but from recognition. You were known as someone who behaved correctly. That knowledge carried a small comfort of its own, but even that comfort was restrained. You did not seek affirmation openly. You did not ask whether you were liked. You inferred it from continued inclusion. If invitations kept arriving, you were doing well enough. If they stopped, you understood without being told. This made social life less emotionally volatile, but also less expressive. Feelings were filtered through behavior rather than language. Approval showed itself through proximity, disapproval through distance. Everything was indirect, which made it easier to deny and harder to confront. The symposium did not resolve conflict. It prevented it from escalating. Differences remained, but they were managed. Sharp edges were dulled by repetition and time. People grew used to each other's presence, if not their ideas. Familiarity softened friction. In that sense, these gatherings functioned like a pressure release valve that never fully opened. Just enough steam escaped to keep the system from breaking, not enough to cause disruption. The balance was delicate, and it was maintained nightly, one measured cup at a time. From a modern perspective, this can feel emotionally sparse. We are used to gatherings that promise something fun, connection, transformation. Ancient Greek parties promised none of these explicitly. They promised continuity. You would still be part of the group tomorrow. The world would look the same when you woke up. That promise mattered more than excitement. In uncertain times, sameness was reassuring. Knowing what an evening would be like reduced anxiety. Knowing how people would behave reduced risk. The symposium offered that predictability reliably, even if it did little else. As centuries passed, this rhythm became woven into cultural memory. The image of reclining thinkers endured because it looked calm and orderly. The boredom, the discomfort, and the quiet mental effort disappeared from view. History preserved the surface and lost the sensation. But lived experience is always heavier than its image. It includes the weight of waiting, the strain of attention, the relief of endings. Those elements do not translate easily into text or art. They are felt, not recorded. If you imagine yourself attending one of these ancient Greek parties again, at the very end of this long description, try to imagine the feeling, not during the evening, but after, the moment you leave, the moment you straighten your back, The moment the noise fades and the street opens in front of you, that moment was probably the most honest part of the night. Not triumphant, not joyful, just quietly easier. And that ease, brief as it was, may have been enough to make the effort worthwhile. You endured the ritual to earn the release. You participated in order to return to yourself, unchanged but intact. Ancient Greek parties were not meant to give you something new. They were meant to allow you to continue, to move through social life without damage, to remain visible without exposure, to exist among others without losing control. They succeeded because they asked so little emotionally and so much behaviorally. They did not care what you felt. They cared how you behaved. And behavior, unlike feeling, can be practiced. So, the couches were laid out. The lamps were lit. The cups were mixed carefully. People arrived, reclined, spoke, listened, waited, and left. Again and again. Until one day, the ritual stopped being lived and started being remembered. And in that memory, it became something more interesting than it ever was in practice. But for those who were there, night after night, it was simply another evening handled correctly. And then, finally, sleep.